Welcome back to Faith Uncovered. Today, we're digging into one of Christianity's most dramatic traditions, the stories behind the deaths of the apostles.
I'm really excited about this. The mix of history and legend here is fascinating, right?
Absolutely. Let's start with James, the son of Zebedee. Now, his execution by Herod Agrippa around 44 AD is the only apostolic death recorded in the New Testament.
Right.
It's a single sentence in Acts, minimal detail, which makes you wonder if it's really meant as a historical note or just a passing remark.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sort of sets the stage for everything else being later embellishments, doesn't it?
Exactly. When you move on to Peter and Paul, things get even more dramatic, and also a lot more secondhand. Tradition claims Peter was crucified upside down, and Paul was beheaded in Rome under Nero. But these details come from writers like Clement and Eusebius, writing decades later.
Really intriguing. So these stories likely weren't eyewitness accounts at all. They were crafted later to inspire the faithful?
Precisely. They're so colorful. It's almost like they were designed to be heroic myths rather than strict history. You know, it's like they wanted to give them this super larger-than-life quality.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's Judas Iscariot, whose death is portrayed in two wildly different ways. One version says he just hanged himself, and another bizarre account even has him falling and exploding, spilling his guts everywhere.
Right, that contradiction really highlights how these stories can go off the rails. One moment it's a quiet suicide, the next it's almost cartoonish violence.
Mm-hmm. It almost sounds, like it's been retold to serve different symbolic meanings instead of factual accuracy.
Exactly. And then take Andrew. Tradition tells us he died on an X-shaped cross in Greece. But that very specific image only surfaces centuries later, meaning it too might be more legend than documented fact.
So if so many details only appear much later, should we view these narratives as cultural symbols rather than actual history?
That's the big question. On one hand, these stories, like that of Peter and Paul's dramatic ends, capture the imagination and imbue the apostles with a mythic quality.
Yeah, totally. But on the other hand, it does make you wonder how much of it is history and how much is embellishment created to inspire.
Exactly. Then there's John, who, according to later traditions, survived a vat of boiling oil and went on to write Revelation. You have to admit, that's more like a comic book narrative than a historical account.
Mm-hmm. It really stretches the imagination. And what about Thomas, Bartholomew, and Philip? Their martyrdoms come with descriptions of flaying, spearing, and crucifixion, details that really appear to be designed for maximum dramatic effect.
Right. And these dramatic accounts were penned hundreds of years after the fact, clearly intended to stir up the emotions of believers rather than report cold, hard facts.
It makes one wonder, were these stories created more to, build a foundation for faith rather than to document history?
That's exactly it. The legends were, in many ways, useful. They provided a rallying cry, a set of heroic examples at a time when the early church was facing persecution and needed inspirational figures.
Yeah, definitely. But here's something I want to challenge. While it's clear that these embellishments served a purpose, isn't there still value in preserving these stories as part of the faith's cultural heritage?
I see your point. And absolutely, these stories have shaped the identity of early Christianity. However, from a historian's perspective, it's important to separate the inspirational narrative from what can actually be corroborated by evidence.
Right, that's a fair distinction. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? On one side, the legends provide a powerful symbolic legacy, and on the other, the lack of contemporary sources makes it hard to pin down the real events.
Exactly. For many of the apostles, Simon the Zealot, Matthias, Jude, James the Less, we have barely any reliable information about their lives or deaths. Their biographies are so vague, they're almost like recycled plot lines from other saintly narratives.
And that really underscores the point. We know next to nothing with certainty about how most of these apostles died. Yeah.
Precisely. What we're left with is a handful of plausible historical events, like James's execution, and then a mountain of legendary embellishments that grew over time. It's a case where the legend may have become more important than the truth.
It kind of reminds me of how, in many traditions, the story you tell can be more potent than the factual account. But then again, doesn't that risk distorting our understanding of history?
It does, and that's a valid critique. When these embellished narratives are taken at face value, they can obscure the actual historical experience of these figures. Yet, they also serve to consolidate a growing faith community under shared ideals, even if the exact events are murky.
Exactly. So would you say that in this case, the myth was in some ways more functional than pure truth?
Yeah, it's like the legend became a kind of cultural glue. It provided a motivational template for what making a sacrifice meant in a time of severe persecution. Even if the details weren't historically vetted, they still carried immense emotional weight.
It's a fascinating, almost paradoxical scenario, where embellishment fuels inspiration, but at the cost of historical clarity.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that as we explore these traditions, we need to keep questioning what is fact and what is narrative flourish.
Right. Keep questioning. And that's what makes this whole discussion so compelling. We're not just looking at martyrdom for its own sake, but also at how these stories reflect the early church's need to, really embody sacrifice and valor through whatever means were available.
Exactly. It's both a study of history and a study of myth-making. The traditions around the apostles reveal a lot about the cultural and political forces at work during those turbulent early centuries.
Well said. And interestingly, because they were written long after the events, these accounts could be tailored to serve specific agendas, whether that's to bolster a persecuted community's resolve or to legitimize authority in later church structures.
Yes, that's spot on. The layering of tradition over fact shows us that while these stories are compelling, they were also carefully curated to resonate with the needs of evolving congregations.
Yeah, it really does underscore the importance of context. It reminds me of the saying, the story is more important than the truth, especially when the truth is hard to nail down with hard evidence. But then, doesn't that sometimes compromise our understanding of historical reality?
That's a respectful challenge, and I agree. It does compromise a straightforward historical picture. Yet it also enriches the narrative art of the faith, giving it layers of meaning that have carried believers through centuries of hardship.
Exactly. So in the end, while the historical record is, surprisingly sparse, these embellished martyrdoms still tell us a lot about the spirit and struggles of early Christianity.
Absolutely. It's as if the legend was more useful and compelling than the bare facts ever could be. And maybe that's what mattered most in turbulent times. A message of unwavering commitment, even if the details are, fuzzy.
Very true. And that's the real takeaway. We need to appreciate these narratives for their inspirational power, while also, continually questioning and seeking out what historical evidence we can.
Right on. Keep questioning, stay curious, and remember that over time, the line between historical fact and legendary embellishment can sometimes blur in fascinating ways.
Exactly. Thanks for exploring these layered narratives with me today. Until next time, let's keep challenging accepted lore and unraveling the threads of tradition.
Thanks for listening. Stay curious out there, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.